Hey there, Hour of History fans. Hopefully, you had a wonderful opening day and you're going to have a great opening day weekend. Apologies to those of you who are outside the American sphere of influence and have no idea what I'm talking about. It's opening day of baseball season, and baseball's an important cultural artifact for us historians. Anyone who studies the United States, or indeed Cuba, has to come across baseball in their cultural analysis at some point. And it's the subject of our talk today because I have on the show Cesar Brioso, who's a seasoned sports journalist. He's written for a number of publications and currently the digital producer for USA Today Sports. He's also an expert on Cuban baseball. The evidence is there. You can read his books, Havana Hardball, which was published by the University of Florida Press in 2015, and shows the sort of transnational journeys between these pro baseball players, some that we know, like Tommy Lasorda, who used to go down and play in Havana, others like Jackie Robinson, who are of worldwide fame for breaking the color barrier in the United States, got some practice first in Cuba. He's most recently written The Last Seasons in Havana, put out by University of Nebraska Press in 2019, which offers insight into those final seasons as the revolution was occurring. So we're talking 1959, 60, very interesting stuff. If you're interested in Cuba or the revolution, American-Cuban relations, or baseball, you're going to love this conversation. Hour of History has recently started producing some video content, so head on over to our YouTube page, the Hour of History podcast, and you will find a new minute of history. So if you don't have a time for our long, wonderful conversations, which I hope you do, I have shorter content for you as well. So once again, thanks for subscribing and liking those. I've talked far too long and delayed this conversation for far too long. Let's get started.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast.
Our world, anytime, any place.
With your host, Stephen Bauman, and producer, James Abel. The Hour of History is a member of Episodic Network, an association of fun, interesting, and informative podcasts. EpisodicNetwork.com. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, and it is so great to have Cesar Brioso with me on Hour of History. How are you doing, Cesar?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It has been such a pleasure to sort of read your books on Cuban history. I've had the pleasure of studying Cuba and Havana for a while, and when I saw you had written a new book on the last seasons in Cuba, it had my attention. Can you just give us a little background on why Cuban baseball?
Sure. Well, I was born in Cuba, though when my family came here, I was only 5 months old. But my dad grew up in Havana. He was a fan of one of the teams in the Cuban Winter League, Almendares. And when I was a kid, he would tell me these stories about American players who would come in the winter and play. Tom Lasorda, Monty Irvin, Ray Dandridge, a guy named Kevin Connors, who became much more famous as Chuck Connors, the actor from the Rifleman TV series. But he would tell me all these stories about players coming down there. And, when I was a kid, I probably didn't focus too much on them. I was more interested in the games that were being played at the time. But as I got older and grew to appreciate the history of baseball, I became much more interested. Eventually became a sports writer and started finding these guys as retirees in Florida, did articles on them for the various papers I worked for, and started collecting interviews, hoping down the road to do some kind of a book on Cuban baseball history, and eventually got the chance with the first book, Havana Hardball.
And it's so fantastic to hear these personal connections. And you don't always see it in books, but in your book that your father is present. Were these stories he was telling you? Were they after you had left Cuba? Was he sort of reminiscing?
Yeah. Like I said, I was only 5 months old when we left, so I have no recollection of Cuba. The only time I've ever seen the island was actually from a plane flying over on my way to Jamaica for a vacation. He would tell me these stories about Cuba and baseball. He knew I was a baseball fan, obviously, and so was he. I grew up in New York. We were Yankees fans, and he would just tell me stories about his experience with being a baseball fan in Cuba. And, whenever we would see like Tom Lasorda, managing the Dodgers, he would tell me, oh, here's a guy who played in Cuba, Bill Verdon, who's a Astros manager back in the day. Anytime he would see somebody that he knew from playing in Cuba, he'd mention it to me.
And growing up in New York, did you find baseball to be the sort of central sport? We just had opening day yesterday, and it's opening weekend, and there is this concern about baseball's kind of influence in America going away. What was the context like with you growing up?
Well, I was very young in New York, and then in the middle of grade school moved to New Jersey. But I grew up watching Yankees games on WPIX Channel 11 my whole time through grade school. I had family in New York. Some of them were Mets fans, so it wasn't. It was pretty common for us to spend a Sunday in New York, and we'd spend the afternoon watching the Yankee game and then turn on the Mets game. So, back then that was huge. In the 70s, this is what I'm talking about. And, baseball was always my favorite sport as a kid. And probably, being in New York at that time was part of it.
And now you've written 2 books. You mentioned Havana Hardball came out in 2015, and Last Seasons in Havana comes out this year. And hopefully we can touch on a little bit of them, a little bit of both of them. But how do you recreate this island and this professional league that you had no personal contact with? As a historian, how did you bring it back to life?
Well, I think the main thing was talking to people who experienced, talking to guys who'd played at that time. With the first book, it was about in 1940s, around the time when Jackie Robinson came to Havana for spring training with the Dodgers right before breaking the baseball's color barrier in 1947. And so I was able to talk to Don Newcomb. Interviewed him over the phone, talked to Sam Lacey, a writer for the Baltimore Afro-American. He was down there covering Robinson spring training, knowing that he might be breaking the color barrier that season. And then the book also talks about this great finish in the Cuban League, just as it was finishing up. With this fantastic series between Almendares and Alana, the eternal rivals in the Cuban League. That's when Jackie Robinson showed up. So the book talks about both those storylines. And I talked to former players who had played in the Cuban League in that 1946-47 Winter League season. So, I think in terms of trying to recreate what happened, that's sort of the primary source, trying to find people who lived it, who experienced it. The other thing was newspaper articles, right? The first draft of history. Mm-hmm. The sporting news back then, it was the Baseball Bible, and it did a terrific job covering not just the Cuban League, but all the Latin leagues. Every week there would be a report from Cuba, sort of a main story, and then a recap of all what happened in the games that week, and whatever news was going on. And related to what I was writing about in that first book, there was quite a bit of news. One of the things that was going on was the Mexican League was trying to raid players from Major League Baseball, and Commissioner Happy Chandler declared that any of those players who jumped their contracts would be ineligible to play in organized baseball for at least 5 years. But he also declared that anybody who participated in games with or against those players were ineligible, and that impacted the Cuban League. So there was quite a bit of news being covered related to Cuba and the Mexican League and Major League Baseball and the sporting news at that time. And of course, as far as the Jackie Robinson angle, the New York Times had a writer covering them throughout that spring training in Havana when they did a side trip to Panama. So that, pulling all that stuff together, that's kind of how I was able to recreate this era, hopefully well, that I didn't experience. It was well before my time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's fascinating, when we start these conversations, we're talking about Cuba, right? An island, a nation in the Caribbean that's rather small compared to other, non-island nations. But already in the conversation, you kind of see how linked it is, even back in the 1940s, to places like New York, Mexico, Panama. It really is a global sport, baseball. Did you find those connections just to be overwhelming? How did you know which ones to trace? How did you follow these leads?
There was Roberto Gonzalez Echeverria wrote this terrific sort of seminal history of Cuban baseball, Pride of Havana. It really covers the entire breadth of it. And I had read that book earlier, and he had written an article sort of on this topic, what happened right at the end of the the Cuban League, and then Jackie Robinson's arrival that I had read years before. So when a professor of mine, from a journalism professor, sort of put me in touch with one of his publishers for the first book, Roberto Gonzalez Echeverria's book has already been written, so I knew that I couldn't write, it wouldn't make sense to try to write the full history again. I really needed to drill down on a specific time frame. And it was that the 46, 47, 48 era. So that kind of focused my research, if you will. And then I just started, looking around. There were articles, there were books that sort of covered bits and pieces of this that I was able to glean information from. But what you mentioned about the global aspect of the sport, especially with Cuba. I mean, baseball was introduced there in the 1860s. Well-to-do Cuban families would send their kids to study in America, and they brought the game with them there, and eventually an actual professional league was formed in 1878, just a couple of years after the National League was formed here in the United States. So, the ties, baseball ties between Cuba and the U.S. Go back decades and decades into the 19th century.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating for me to think, and I'm glad you mentioned Pride of Havana. Echevarria's book is fantastic, and but just the foundation, we're kind of, I've seen some blurbs about, celebrating the Reds, for how long they've been a professional sports franchise. But at the same time, Cuba gets started really early, but the thing that's always fascinated me about Cuba is, these professional leagues are starting when slavery is still legal in Cuba. It's just kind of an extraordinary thought, because we kind of think as professional sports, maybe it's a newer thing, but at the same, and then, slavery might be antiquated or whatever, but these things are happening at the same time. Yet you have figures like Jackie Robinson who are, who have a totally different perspective when they go to Cuba versus training in Florida. Could you describe a little bit what Jackie Robinson saw in Cuba versus Florida or New York?
Well, I think it's important before that to really explain that the Cuban League was integrated by 1900. So there were black, white, Latino players playing together as teammates, as competitors in the Cuban League well before that happened in Major League Baseball. The Negro League players individually would come down in the winter and play with Cuban League teams. Negro League teams barnstormed Havana and throughout Cuba during the first half of the 20th century. So there was, going to the Latin leagues was a place where players from the Negro Leagues could go play and in many cases be treated better than they were here in the United States. Jackie Robinson found it a little different in his situation. right? When he was there in 1947, he was there as a member of the Montreal Royals, the Dodgers AAA team. And Branch Rickey, I guess really out of an abundance of caution that was probably unnecessary, given that they were going to be doing spring training in Havana, kept the black players on the Royals. It was Robinson, Don Newcomb, Roy Partlow, and Roy Campanella. They didn't stay with the rest of the Royals. They were housed at the Havana Military Academy. It was a school about 10 miles or so outside Havana. So they were put in a hotel in Old Havana and were driven back and forth each day. And Robinson didn't understand that. One of the quotes was, "I thought we came to Havana to get away from Jim Crow." Branch Rickey had trained in Dodgers had trained the previous spring in Daytona. There were issues. That was Robinson's first with the Royals, and so to avoid any of the issues with the Jim Crow laws, he moved in '47 moved the spring training camp to Havana. So Robinson couldn't understand why they were being segregated. And it really, there wouldn't have been an issue in Cuba. And you have to remember that Robinson just completed playing 1946 with the Royals. The entire season, was the International League Rookie of the Year. There were no issues in Montreal. It was a pretty progressive city. When they had issues is when they might have went on the road to other cities in the International League. So there really would not have been a problem with the black players playing or being housed along with the white players on the Royals. So his experience in Cuba was a little different. I don't think he enjoyed it very much.
But the other players like, Tommy Lasorda that you mentioned before, who didn't just train in Cuba, but, played there, they had a, totally different experience, right?
Yeah, and I think for not just for like white players like Tommy Lasorda, I think for black players coming there to the Cuban League in the first half of the 20th century, they had a good experience. It's just that Robinson was in this very unique situation, trying to be the first to break the color barrier, and then Branch Rickey's sort of maybe micromanaging a bit too much what was going on with the minor league camp at the time. But yeah, other players loved going down there. Tommy Lasorda, years later as a manager, would talk about how much he enjoyed playing in Cuba when there were worries during the Castro Revolution, which is what the second book, Last Seasons in Havana, is about. Some of the major league owners were worried about letting their players continue to play in the Cuban League, not just the major league owners, but also the minor league presidents as well, about having their guys down there during the revolution. And Lasorda defended playing in Havana and how well the American players were treated there during that time.
Yeah, it is a good bridge to your next book, and the International League kind of takes us there as well. The International League is an important league in baseball history.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it came to Havana in 1954. Cuba had a team, the Havana Cubans, in the Florida International League that started in 1946. And Bobby Maduro, who built El Gran Stadium of Havana, he was a owner of Cienfuegos in the Cuban League for a time. He bought the Havana Cubans and moved them to the International League as the Havana Sugar Kings in 1954. And his goal with that team was to eventually, hopefully, bring an expansion major league team to Havana.
And that's kind of one of those points that people, it still comes up in conversation frequently. Like, if the revolution hadn't happened, there would be professional MLB team in Havana, so on and so forth. But the Havana Sugar Kings, they were a minor league team, yeah?
Yeah, they were a AAA team. That was the International League. But the team motto was, in Spanish, it's un paso más y llegamos, one more step and we get there. And that wasn't just an allusion to the AAA players trying to get to the majors, but also to Havana trying to eventually land a major league team.
And up through, this early period, it seemed like that was a real possibility, and attendance was good. People enjoyed going there, but Cuba had so much unrest. Can you describe a little bit about the unrest? We're between basically Batista and Castro, where neither is really an ideal situation for an investor.
Well, no, I mean, Batista comes to power in 1952 in a coup. And right away, there are groups trying to oust him. And it wasn't just Castro in the mountains in the eastern provinces of Cuba. There were multiple groups trying to depose Batista, some trying to get the previously democratically elected President Prio back in power. So all that was going on in the sort of mid to late 50s. But not, there is American investment during that time, during the Batista, even though he took power through a coup. The U.S. government recognized him pretty quickly, and there continues to be not just commercial exchanges, but people go down to Cuba on vacation. Cubans can come to the U.S. Freely, so that's still going on during those last seasons of the Batista regime. And even as Castro starts his revolution, much of the fighting is going on in the eastern provinces. So there is not sort of the fighting isn't going on in Havana, so there isn't that kind of impact. But then when Batista flees the island in January 1, 1959, in the early morning hours, and Castro rides triumphantly into the city several days later, he's hailed as a hero. People are whatever concerns Maduro and organized baseball had about what might be going on, would it be safe to play there, they feel like the worst is past, and things will now be better. But they start to turn slowly, but you do see that things change. Signs that the regime is turning toward communism. There's strained relations between the U.S. and Cuba start to be strained, and the International League is starting to form contingency plans about what if things really get bad. Maybe we have to remove the franchise from Havana.
So was the International League the owner of the franchise?
No, Maduro owned the Sugar Kings.
Okay, got it.
But, they, just like Major League Baseball had a league president, Frank Shaughnessy, and, all the owners of the various teams, would have to vote on this contingency plan of what they might do if things get bad in Cuba. Because now that Castro is in charge and things are starting to turn, you also start to see some counter-revolutionary activities. Now it's happening in Havana. There's unrest there, and that starts to worry the International League and also Major League Baseball about having their players in the Cuban League.
Interesting. And one of the things that I've noticed of these books, and it's typical of Cuban history, the centrality of Havana, the capital city, the most populous city, the one all the tourists went to. It's where the professional baseball league is. But the revolution is starting on the other side of the island. Can you talk a little bit about the centrality of Havana? Both you and Echevarria use it in your titles. talk about the centrality of Havana rather than Cuba as a whole, or maybe the differences. Yeah.
Yeah, it rather than the Cuban League, while it has teams, Havana, Cienfuegos, Marianao, who at least nominally represent different areas of the country, the league is centralized in Havana. That really began with the previous stadium, La Tropical. In the 1930s, that's where the league was played. It was built it wasn't a baseball-only facility. It also could accommodate soccer, had an Olympic track. It was adjacent to La Tropical Brewery, so there were beer gardens and dance halls. It was originally built to be able to host Pan American games. And it was there through the 30s and early 40s where the Cuban League played. Before that, individual teams had their stadiums, but it became focused in this La Tropical, which is on the outskirts of the city, closer to the Marianao area. But then Maduro comes and in 1946 builds El Gran Stadium, which still stands. It's where the Rays went to play the Cuban national team for that exhibition game with President Obama in attendance. It's now called Estadio Latinoamericano, but that stadium still exists, and that stadium is much closer to the heart of Havana. It's a baseball-only facility, more seating, 35,000 as opposed to the 20,000 at La Tropical. So yeah, the league was very central, and that was a selling point, right? Because you would have these guys from the majors and the minors coming in the winter, and there was no travel. You would play all your games in Havana. Winter League, you might play 4 games a week, so you'd had downtime. So it was almost a working vacation in a sense. They could play baseball, stay in shape, and still have time. Some players would bring their wives and families and make a little vacation out of their time there. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the draws to coming to play in the winter in Cuba.
It's very interesting. And the Cuban players, were they from mostly Havana, or did you get players from like Santiago or?
No, there were players from all around. Minnie Minoso was from the Perico, from a sugar mill town, outside of Havana. So yeah, you would get players from Havana, from the countryside, from all over.
And now, if we could go a little bit to the revolution, I've always, it's frustrating in a lot of ways studying Cuban history because there's so much written on the revolution, and it's refreshing always to see these books that come out on different time periods. But the revolution certainly captures the imagination, obviously for important reasons. But what I'm interested in is how quickly Castro sort of adopts baseball as a, he senses the importance of baseball's centrality to Cuban identity. Can you talk a little bit about that? How does he use baseball as a sort of PR campaign?
Well, yeah, he's in attendance for opening day, for the Sugar Kings, especially. You talk about the centrality. The Sugar Kings were not just Havana's minor league team; they were really the country's team. So there, as opposed to the Cuban League, where you had divided loyalties, especially between Almendares and Havana, and Cienfuegos and Marianao to a lesser extent in the fan base. But this was one team that united all Cubans as fans. And Castro certainly used that. There's the famous exhibition game, a 3-inning with the barbudos, the bearded ones. That's where you see Castro in a baseball uniform with some of his soldiers. They're playing a police team for 3 innings right before a Sugar Kings game, and the money was money from the ticket revenues was used for to help fund certain elements of the revolution now that he's taken control of the country. So there's that. When the Sugar Kings in 1959 reached the Junior World Series against the Minneapolis Millers, the champions of the American Association, Castro is there to throw out the opening pitch of all five games that were played in Havana. The series began in Minneapolis, but the weather there was terrible, cold, snow, rain. They were getting, for those first two games, attendance in the hundreds, and the league decided to move the remainder of the series to Havana to try and, boost tickets for gate shares for the teams and the league. So the last five games were played in Havana, and Castro was there throwing out the first pitch, to adoring crowds for that and for all five of those games.
And what a fascinating contrast there in the last junior league, the last one in Havana, between Minneapolis and Havana. I can't imagine, two kind of more different cities.
There's a photo, and it's in the book, of Cookie Rojas and a couple of other players for the Sugar Kings sitting in the dugout in Minneapolis, and they've got a fire going in the garbage can, trying to keep during one of those first two games.
Awesome. Yeah. And, it is those pictures, especially from Los Barbudos, that are always coming up with Cuban baseball. But it's interesting, it's only a 3-inning sort of like PR stunt. I'm trying to think of if there's like any sort of analogous situation we have in American sports.
Yeah, it would be hard because
it's extraordinary, right?
Yeah, it's one of the players who played in that game, Johnny Gorold, talked about the sound that the fans were waving white handkerchiefs during the pregame ceremonies, and he talked about hearing that flapping sound that those handkerchiefs would make. I don't know that it would be difficult to find an analogy here to what was going on in terms of the PR stunt, as you talk about it, sort of using baseball as a propaganda tool.
Yeah, and it's interesting, we always talk about, certainly in the United States, I should be careful when I say we, because, people are listening from all over the place, but America is often referred to as, having baseball as its national pastime. But you kind of look at the passion that Cubans had, at least. I think it's changed recently, but at least had for baseball, and it seems like so much more. Is that a false sort of read on it? Do you think that baseball is much bigger pastime
in Cuba than here?
Yeah, maybe even we could take it in a historical context, because baseball was obviously bigger here in earlier decades.
Yeah, I mean, baseball without question was Cuba's national sport, and that was born out of the fight for independence from Spain. In the late 1900s, baseball was one way of the Cuban peoples expressing their rejection of Spanish colonial rule. They consciously chose baseball over bullfighting, for example, which was the preferred sport of the the Spanish colonial government in Cuba. So during those battles for independence, exile groups in the United States, they would sometimes play baseball games, whether in Key West or Tampa, Ybor City, sometimes with funds going back to Cuba for the war effort. So baseball really became ingrained in Cuban identity.
Yeah, and it's fascinating.
Fight for independence.
Anytime I teach something like this, I do use some of these images, and I try to challenge students to think of, like, what would a revolutionary sort of activity, a revolutionary cultural activity be today. But anyway, you have this great story in your book about this meeting with Ernesto Che Guevara after the championship. And
talking about with Orlando Pena and
yeah,
he became he was put in charge of the National Bank of Cuba, and they were Pena and Willie Miranda went in there trying to figure out basically how to get, for the upcoming major league season. Miranda was trying to get his car that had American license plates, because that's where he had bought it, back on the ferry so he could have it for the upcoming major league season. And we're basically that, you're going to have to pay money to get your car out of here. And how that, Che Guevara knew certain things about him that how on earth would he know that? And Orlando Pena, who relayed the story to me, just said somebody must have, basically ratted him out in the sense that he had gotten as a gift a gun from someone who was related to Batista. And it was a fascinating and frightening experience.
Yeah, and so when we're talking to these people, and especially from that story, you can kind of see the walls closing in on these people that had something going. Did you find in your interviews, what was the emotion? Were people mostly, were they angry? Were they sort of, I don't know. How did they view these years that were so far removed?
I mean, a lot of times I would get I'm not into politics, I was a ball player kind of response. It just depended. I think, in the first book, Andres Fleitas, who was a catcher for Almendares, he was one of the ones who was very open about, talking about how that man, referring to Castro, destroyed everything. And maybe because he was of an earlier era, he played in the 40s, probably never imagining that something like that could happen. But then like in the guys that I talked to who played in the 50s, some of them, and maybe also the passage of time, they're sort of resigned. Look, it happened, we move on. But Louis Tiao talked about how difficult it was. It was his dad who, basically, when he was pitching in Mexico at the time, he was going to come back and have his honeymoon in Cuba, and his father was the one who warned him and said, "Don't come back." And it took 25 years for him to be reunited with his parents in the 1975 World Series. So the reaction, talking about the time. What happened is it just sort of varies from person to person.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And as you get towards the end and the league decides to, or the league and the team and the players, everyone has to sort of confront their own destiny and make their own decision. You talk a little bit about how your own family was even torn on some things.
Yeah, my just as the revolution split families, not just individual families, not just the country. My grandfather was one of 11 siblings. 5 or 6 of them became sympathetic toward the communist regime, and that led to many arguments and fights within the family. If you didn't support the revolution, you were ostracized. My uncle was rounded up and put in La Cabaña fortress by the Castro regime, fortunately only for a month and a half, and he was let go unharmed, but he heard the sounds of firing squads while he was there. And at a family gathering, one of the siblings who was sympathetic to the revolution talked about wanting to gun down all the prisoners at La Cabaña, knowing that my uncle was there. So yeah, and in many cases, some families when they split, they never spoke again.
Yeah, and that's, that is one thing that we find in revolutions in every society, whether it be Korea or Cuba. When there's a revolution, it splits people sometimes for forever. Can you talk about the ball club? I mean, to go from very serious to, I mean, yeah, baseball serious too, but the Sugar Kings have to find a new home, and I find their journey kind of fascinating.
Yeah, there were sort of a contingency plan. What would they do if things got really bad? Uh, and this was in 1960. The season had started. There was all kinds of unrest, counter-revolutionary activity against the Castro regime going on now in Havana. Um, and at one point, there's an explosion in the like loading docks near the stadium. It was felt at the stadium. And finally, Frank Shaughnessy, the president of the International League, decides to pull the trigger on the move. And while the Sugar Kings are on a long road trip, relocates the franchise to Jersey City. So at the end of the road trip, instead of going back to Havana, they're going on to Jersey City. The manager resigns, goes back. Napoleon Reyes, who has been a longtime player and manager in Cuba, he takes over the squad in Jersey City. And the move happens fast enough that they don't even have new uniforms for their debut in Jersey City. So they've got their home white pinstripe uniforms that normally say Cubanos, Cubans, in script across the chest. They put a patch over it that says Jersey City, and you can see in photos that it's basically just stitched on to the original uniform. They did manage to get caps with a JC on them, but for that debut they didn't have a new uniform. So that's how abrupt the change was for them. And guys had to make a decision about whether or not to continue playing. There was a thought that a lot of them would, the Cuban players on the Sugar Kings, might return. They ended up all staying with the team and continuing. They brought their families. They lived in a hotel in Jersey City for the remainder of the season.
Yeah, and it's just again, just those connections and how life keeps going. So your book is the last seasons in Havana, and it's focusing on this professional game. But so this might be a little outside of your scope. It's a provocative title because baseball does continue in Cuba.
Right. It just continues in a very different form. The professional game where guys are paid to play, and can sign with whichever team they choose. They can come to play in the summer in organized baseball here in the United States. That's what goes away. But obviously baseball continues. It continues in more of an amateur form, a socialist model of baseball, if you will, where the players are, that they are full-time baseball players. So that's true. So they are, that is what they do for a living, if you will. But it's certainly not the same as it was during before the revolution. And the subtitle, as the subtitle says, the Castro Revolution and the end of professional baseball in Cuba. So that's what is the last. That's what changes. And Cuba, basically right after the final season of the Cuban League, 60-61, a couple of weeks, it officially passes a law outlawing professionalism in sports there. They nationalize baseball, where now each province has a provincial team, and those teams in the Serie Nacional, eventually what's formed, provide players to the Cuban national team that we have seen for since the 1960s, playing on an international stage, whether World Cup or the Olympics, various international tournaments.
And it's interesting that even though there's been that sort of continuity, and this is again outside of the scope of the book, but as baseball kind of continues, there's still this question, because what you're making 90 miles, 100 miles away from Florida is significantly less than what you could potentially be making. So although some people ended up flourishing in the Cuban system, like say Victor Mesa, his son is now gone, has defected. Have you covered that any in your journalism?
And I follow it, and other books that have written about that topic. I mean, what you've seen, for the first, say, 40, 50 years was no exchange whatsoever, in terms of players being able to get here and us being able to see these talented guys. Post-revolution, Omar Linares, a longtime third baseman in the Cuban national team, he played in the Atlanta Olympics, widely regarded as perhaps the best player of that era, that nobody ever got to see, but major league scouts drooled over the possibility of signing him. And then now in the last, say, 15 years or so, you've seen this spate of defections, and that really sort of shows that there continued to be talent and quality baseball being played on the island. When you see whether it's Yasiel Puig or Cespedes, Jose Abreu, these guys who have Aroldis Chapman, guys who have defected and had immediate impacts here in the majors. So but that they have had to defect, and all the dangers involved with that. Hiring people to smuggle them out of the country and such.
Yeah, it's just those are some really fascinating stories out there. And one thing I like to always bring to the listeners is sort of how you can grow from a hobby to a book or something like that. You were a professional journalist, but at the same time, your blog is a central part of how you got the book, right?
Yeah, that's right. I had been sort of researching and gathering stuff since the 90s, really, when I first started, when I first became, got out of school and started working as a journalist. But I had no real way of getting into, no ties, connections to get me into the publishing business, and early attempts in terms of, query letters and sort of trying to make proposals just didn't work. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I kept researching, and, life happens, job, family, and I just kind of decided, what, I'm never going to write that book, so I'm just going to write a blog about Cuban baseball history. I might be the only person that reads it. That'll be my outlet for this material I've gathered. And I started doing that. And then that's when I mentioned earlier, I think that I heard from a former journalism professor. He had been a published author, and he had seen some of this stuff and asked me if I, emailed me, asked me if I had a publisher for all this material. And I not knowing whether he was actually about to suggest one or if he was just making small talk, I said, no, why? You got somebody in mind? And he said, well, I might. And that's when he put me in touch with the University Press of Florida, the publishers of the first book. And it's true what I've heard, that once you're published, it's easy to get published. So the second one was much shorter time in the making than the first one.
But they're both academic presses.
Yeah.
Which is, are you interested in writing for a popular press? Like say you move on your third book, I find it really useful that they're academic presses as someone, who's tied into these organizations.
Right. Well, that's the in I had, right? University Press of Florida. When I went to go write the second one, obviously I was going to send them a proposal, but then I went to was on a panel at SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, and the person who had asked me to be on that panel talking about Cuban baseball or Latin American baseball, he introduced me to these other publishers that specialize in baseball book, Nebraska Press, McFarland, who were there at the convention. And, because he made that connection, they said, well, what's your next book? Send me a proposal. So I was able to send the book's proposal to the second book to multiple publishers. But, how do you go from there to Simon and Schuster? I don't know.
Well, you just have to go to the right conferences and meet the right people. And you, so you're at that stage now where you're going all over the country, you're giving book talks, this must be exhausting, or do you find relief in this part of the publishing process?
I don't know about relief, but the hardest thing is just trying to keep all the events straight in my head. We did 3 book signings this month. We got 3 coming up next month. So just some radio and podcast interviews. So
yeah.
Just trying to keep everything straight and making sure that I don't forget one of these events. That's the hardest part, is just the logistic and scheduling and making sure I've got the time off from work to be able to do all these things.
Yeah, and I always find it so fantastic. This is my favorite book origin story, where it starts as a blog, and it is fascinating. And we'll have the link to your blog on Hour of History, and you can go check it out for yourself. But it's just so cool, and I always talk to people and kind of say, are you writing this down? Because a lot of people are out there doing the research, but they're, or they don't see it as research. When did it consciously become research to you?
Well, it became research in the 90s, when I was starting to gather these interviews and hunting down books that may have touched on bits and pieces, and gathering articles from newspapers of the time and that sort of thing. So it was research, early on.
And you had that skill set too of being an established writer and knowing how to collect research as well.
Yeah, and in some cases I was writing for, I took the research I was gathering and then wrote an article for whatever newspaper I might have been working for at the time. When the Orioles went down to Cuba to play that exhibition game, what was that, 98, 99?
99, yeah.
99. I was working at the Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale, and I pitched to go. They were only going to send one of the columnists, but so instead I wrote a long article about the history of Cuban baseball.
Very cool.
In order to advance the Orioles trip. So, wherever I could, in my job as a daily journalist, I looked for opportunities where I could potentially use the research for articles for the paper I was working at the time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think historians have a lot to learn from journalists, because, you guys really are, you have some of those soft power skills that historians need to work on. That's great. Okay, so we're drawing close to the end here, and I want to make sure we have time for our suggestions. Okay. Yeah, so what do you have for us? So you can suggest anything under the sun for the listeners of Hour of History.
Well, this might be pie in the sky kind of thing, because you have to be in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But if you're ever there, or you're going to school there, or living in that area, there is a Professor Rich McGraw. He invited me down to speak to his class about the book, and the reason is because the class that one of the classes he teaches is called The American Game, and it focuses on baseball and its place in American culture. And so if you have a chance to take the class, audit the class, it sounds fascinating. I looked over the syllabus. I wish I had a class like that when I was at school.
That is so cool.
Yeah, so I just thought that was great when he contacted me and asked me to speak at his class.
And that's coming up this spring?
Yeah, I think that is a class in the spring semester down there, because that's when I went down there last spring.
Okay, yeah, that's fantastic. I was lucky enough to teach the global history of soccer one summer at
Oh, wow.
Temple University, and that was kind of it wasn't the same because it was a summer course, but it was a great opportunity, and it's
Yeah,
great to hear they're doing
some of
those.
the courses are out there in various universities. I remember at a community college in Gainesville, Florida, someone told me, a friend said that they had taken a baseball as literature class.
Very cool.
And once they were done, I inherited all of their baseball books from that class, which was great. But
Yeah, no, I encourage any professors to put those syllabus up, because if there's like an established record of this course being successful, it's all the easier to sell. Great. And my suggestion is along these lines. It's the University of Florida Digital Library of the Caribbean. So earlier in our conversation, you were talking about how newspapers were an important part of your research, and Florida, the Latin America library, the Latin America collection is fantastic, and they've been digitizing tons of newspapers from all over. They have them from Cuba for centuries, and it's all online. So like a lot of the research now can start from your laptop on your couch.
That's absolutely right. And I used that very site that you're talking about for articles from Diario de la Marina, which was one of the daily papers in Havana.
Yeah, and that's so cool. And I'm sure those archives are elsewhere, right? Like you use New York Times and things like that.
Yeah, but so much, thankfully, so much is available now online. When I did the first book, I live outside Washington, D.C. I took a day to go to the Library of Congress to try and get Diario de la Marina and the Havana Post there, and I spent an entire day thinking, okay, this will be great. I'll get everything I did, and I didn't come close to scratching the surface. But I couldn't just keep driving in 20 miles all the time.
Yeah, no, it's changing research, and once people start looking around, these newspapers, you just get lost in them. I mean, they're fascinating. So anyway, it's been a pleasure, Cesar Brioso. Go check out his book, Last Seasons in Havana and Havana Hardball, both fantastic books. Thank you so much,
Thank
Cesar.
you.
Great. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.
Thanks again for listening. Make sure to check out hourofhistory.com/Rex for all the recommendations mentioned during the show. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, be sure to head over to our blog at hourofhistory.com/blog, where you'll find topics that were covered in the podcast as well as others. And that concludes this week's episode. We thank you again for listening, and we hope to have you back here next week at the Hour of History podcast.
Hey there, Hour of History podcast fans. Did you know we have a store? Store.hourofhistory.com for all the Hour of History swag you need. Actually, there's only a t-shirt and a mug, but it's pretty cool. Check it out. Store.hourofhistory.com. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.